From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! President Trump pushes Senate Republicans to use the nuclear option, if needed, to push through the confirmation of Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. Meanwhile, Democrats are attempting to fight back by boycotting committee votes on 3 cabinet picks. We'll get the latest with Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post. Plus, we'll speak to an immigration lawyer suing the Trump administration over its ban on refugees and citizens from 7 majority Muslim nations. And we hear the voice of a Holocaust survivor and former refugee, the late grandmother of Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
We never can understand this. Even our good President Roosevelt. How come he kept the door so closed for us for such a long time? How come our boat went for exodus on the border and returned back to you to be killed? This question I'll never know. And nobody will give me the answer. And with this mind, we live a very hard life.
We'll speak with the nation's Lizzie Ratner, author of a new piece, Nobody Wanted to Take Us In, the story of Jared Kushner's family and mine. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The full Senate has confirmed longtime ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State. Reuters reports the 56-43 Senate vote was the closest vote by a wide margin for a Secretary of State nominee in at least a half-century. 3 Democrats backed Tillerson's nomination: Mark Warner of Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Trump's nomination of Tillerson has been widely condemned by environmental activists. Author Naomi Klein has said Tillerson and other Trump cabinet picks represent a corporate coup. The Senate Judiciary Committee also approved the nomination of Senator Jeff Sessions to be Attorney General in a straight party-line vote. Jeff Sessions' confirmation has also faced widespread protests over his opposition to the Voting Rights Act and his history of making racist comments. On Monday, about 10 members of the NAACP, including President Cornell William Brooks, were arrested at a sit-in in Sessions' office in Mobile, Alabama. At Sessions' Senate confirmation hearing in January, protesters wore white hooded robes and pretended to be members of the Ku Klux Klan. Sessions once reportedly said he thought the Ku Klux Klan was, quote, okay until I found out they smoked pot, unquote. On Wednesday, a protester from the group Code Pink disrupted the Senate Judiciary Committee's meeting.
The nomination is approved by the committee and will be reported to the floor. Meeting over.
Further, the nomination of a man who will not protect the vulnerable. That's why we have an attorney general who will protect the
Democratic lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee boycotted committee votes on 2 of Donald Trump's cabinet picks, Steven Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary and Tom Price for Health and Human Services Secretary. The committee rules require at least 1 Democrat present to vote. Republicans on the committee then suspended the rules and voted to send the 2 nominations to the Senate floor. Democrats on the Environment and Public Works Committee also boycotted a vote on Scott Pruitt to become head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Pruitt is a longtime ally of the fossil fuel industry who sued the EPA 14 times. In other Senate news, the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary appears to be on thin ice as 2 Republicans, Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, announced plans to vote against DeVos, leaving Senate Republicans 1 vote short of confirming her. If the Senate vote is 50-50, Vice President Mike Pence would then cast the deciding vote, an event that has never happened to any other presidential nominee in history. DeVos is a longtime backer of charter schools and vouchers for private and religious schools. She and her husband have also invested in a student debt collection agency that does business with the Education Department. As for President Trump's Supreme Court nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch, Trump has urged the Republican leadership to consider using the so-called nuclear option. That is, instituting a rule change to prohibit filibusters to push through the confirmation. Senate Democrats have vowed to filibuster Gorsuch's nomination. International relations between Trump's administration and multiple foreign governments deteriorated Wednesday as Trump's national security advisor publicly threatened Iran, and new information emerged about heated conversations between Trump and the leaders of Mexico and Australia. On Wednesday, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn condemned Iran's recent ballistic missile test launch and said the U.S. is putting Iran on notice.
President Trump has severely criticized the various agreements reached between Iran and the Obama administration, as well as the United Nations, as being weak and ineffective. Instead of being thankful to the United States in these agreements, Iran is now feeling emboldened. As of today, we are officially putting Iran on notice.
Ken? Many experts, as well as Iran's foreign ministry, say the missile test does not violate the terms of a 2015 UN Security Council resolution. The test also does not violate the terms of the landmark 2015 nuclear deal between Iran, the U.S., and other nations. During his campaign, Trump vowed to dismantle the Iran nuclear deal, which he called, quote, the stupidest deal of all time, unquote. The Washington Post is reporting Trump abruptly ended a call between himself and Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull on Saturday after complaining about the terms of a refugee deal between the U.S. and Australia and telling Prime Minister Turnbull that their conversation was the worst call by far that he'd had with a foreign leader that day. Under the Obama administration, the United States had pledged to accept and resettle 1,250 refugees from a detention center in Australia. But when Turnbull asked Trump to confirm the U.S. would honor this agreement, Trump reportedly called it the worst deal ever and claimed the refugees would include the next Boston bombers. The U.S. and Australia have been longtime allies. Meanwhile, the Associated Press is reporting Trump reportedly threatened to send U.S. troops to Mexico during a phone call with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto on Friday. According to excerpts of the transcript obtained by the Associated Press, Trump told Peña Nieto, quote, "You have a bunch of bad hombres down there. You aren't doing enough to stop them. I think your military is scared. Our military isn't, so I just might send them down to take care of it," unquote. In Delaware, prisoners at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center at Smyrna have launched an uprising, taking correctional officers hostage and demanding improved education and rehabilitation services. The rebellion began Wednesday morning when some prisoners took 4 guards hostage and issued their demands. This is a phone call from inside the prison. You have to listen carefully.
Donald Trump, everything that he did, all the things that he's doing now, we know that the institution is going to change for the worse. We know the institution is going to change for the worse. We got demands that you need to pay attention to.
Education. We want education first and foremost. We want a rehabilitation programs that works for everybody. We want the money to be allocated so we can know exactly what's going on in the prison.
2 of the 4 guards taken hostage were released Wednesday. As of this morning, 2 are still hostage, and the uprising continues. In North Dakota, 76 water protectors fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline were arrested Wednesday after militarized police raided a new protest camp set up on historic Sioux Treaty land. The Last Child camp was established on the west side of Highway 1806 near the Maina-Chete-Saquon camp. This land is now owned by Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the pipeline. This is water protector and former North Dakota congressional candidate Chase Ironeyes.
We just established a new camp called the Last Child's Camp in honor of Crazy Horse, who created that warrior society in 1873.
Chase Ironeyes was among the dozens arrested Wednesday. The Army Corps of Engineers appears poised to grant the final permit required for Energy Transfer Partners to finish construction. A group of military veterans called Veterans Stand has vowed to stop the construction of the pipeline. Meanwhile, a jury in Morton County has convicted 8 water protectors of misdemeanor charges related to the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline. In more Dakota Access news, a Seattle City Council committee has has voted to divest $3 billion in city funds from Wells Fargo, and concerns about Wells Fargo's investments in the pipeline. The full Seattle City Council will vote on the legislation on Monday. A mistrial has been declared in the case of environmental activist Ken Ward, who is facing 3 felony charges and 1 misdemeanor charge after he shut off a valve on the Trans Mountain pipeline in Washington state to stop the flow of tar sands oil coming into the United States from Canada in October. His action was part of a coordinated protest during which the valves on pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, and North Dakota were also shut off. The mistrial was declared after a Skagit County, Washington jury couldn't reach a verdict. In Romania, the Minister of Business, Trade and Entrepreneurship has resigned after more than 250,000 people poured into the streets Wednesday to protest the government's passing of an emergency ordinance decriminalizing official misconduct. The protests are the biggest in Romania since 1989. In eastern Ukraine, nearly a dozen soldiers have died in recent days amidst a surge in violence between Ukrainian troops and Russian-backed separatists. European monitors say there's been heavy shelling since the weekend. The U.S. backs the Ukrainian military with training and equipment. Israel's announced it's building an entirely new Jewish-only settlement in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The move marks the first brand-new official settlement in the West Bank built by the Israeli government in about 2 decades, although Israeli settlers have built unofficial settlements, and the Israeli government has dramatically expanded already existing settlements. Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced plans to begin construction on more than 5,000 housing units in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. In Berkeley, California, white nationalist Breitbart news editor Milo Yiannopoulos was forced to cancel his planned speech at the University of California, Berkeley, amidst massive protests. More than 1,000 people came out to demonstrate against him. Yiannopoulos has a long history of making racist, sexist, and xenophobic statements. It's the second time in recent weeks University of California officials have been forced to cancel one of his speeches due to student protests. This morning, President Trump tweeted, quote, "If UC Berkeley does not allow free speech and practices violence on innocent people with a different point of view, no federal funds," unquote. The group Refuse Fascism says, however, quote, "People who protest Milo are not opposing free speech. They're opposing a fascist America, which is the actual, real, and gravely serious threat to basic rights of speech, assembly, and intellectual life," unquote. And President Trump is facing criticism after he appeared to suggest that the great abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery around 1818 and died in 1895, is still, in fact, alive. This is Donald Trump speaking at a Black History Month event on Wednesday.
I am very proud now that we have a museum in the National Mall where people can learn about Reverend King, so many other things. Frederick Douglass is an example of somebody who's done an amazing job and is being recognized more and more, I notice.
That's President Trump speaking about Frederick Douglass, who was one of the most revered abolitionists in U.S. history. Later on Wednesday, reporters asked White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer about Trump's comments. This is Spicer.
About Frederick Douglass being recognized more and more. Do you have any idea what specifically he was referring to?
Well, I think there's contributions. I think he wants to highlight the contributions that he has made, and I think through a lot of the actions and statements that he's going to make, I think the contributions of Frederick Douglass will become more and more.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. It was a chaotic day on Capitol Hill Wednesday. The Senate confirmed Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson by a vote of 56 to 43. Reuters reports it was the closest vote by a wide margin for a Secretary of State nominee in at least a half-century. 3 Democrats backed Tillerson's nomination: Mark Warner of Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia. The Senate Judiciary Committee also approved the nomination of Senator Jeff Sessions to be Attorney General in a straight party-line vote. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee boycotted committee votes on 2 of Donald Trump's cabinet picks, Steven Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary and Tom Price for Health and Human Services Secretary. Republicans on the committee then suspended the rules and voted to send the 2 nominations to the Senate floor. Senator Sherrod Brown defended the Democratic boycott.
What's next is we want the Secretary-designee of Health and Human Services and Secretary-designee of Treasurer to own up. They respected newspapers, conservative newspapers, both say they lied about essential information. In our state, the Secretary of the Treasury, his company, his bank, foreclosed on at least hundreds of Ohioans wrongfully, and I want him to explain what happened, why he did it, what he did, and I would hope he could make people whole when they basically threw people out of their homes.
Democrats on the Environment and Public Works Committee also boycotted a vote on Scott Pruitt to become head of the Environmental Protection Agency. In other Senate news, the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary appears to be on thin ice as 2 Republicans, Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, announced plans to vote against DeVos, leaving Senate Republicans 1 vote short of confirming her. If the Senate vote is 50-50, Vice President Mike Pence would then cast the deciding vote, an event that has never happened to any other presidential nominee in history. DeVos is a longtime backer of charter schools and vouchers for private and religious schools. She and her husband have also invested in a student debt collection agency that does business with the Education Department. And to cap off the day, President Trump urged the Republican leadership to consider using the so-called nuclear option. That's instituting a rule change to prohibit filibusters to push through the confirmation of Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. To make sense of what's happening on Capitol Hill, we're joined now by Ryan Grim, Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post. His most recent piece is headlined, "After trying everything else, Democrats have decided to listen to their voters." So explain what you mean, Ryan.
Well, I mean, if you think about the history of the Democratic Party, you probably have to go back to the early 1970s to find a place where the activist base was kind of leading the party forward. So, you know, right after the inauguration, Democrats, even Democrats like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, were saying, you know, we're willing to work with Donald Trump. We want to give him a chance. And the Democratic base kind of erupted at that. And they were like, no, this person is a lunatic. You cannot work with him. You have to resist him at every step. And kind of the mantra of kind of resist or resign rose up. Then you had millions of people filling the streets with the women's marches, but it didn't stop there. You've had people outside of Democratic offices. You've had phone calls pouring in. And you've really seen the tenor change on Capitol Hill. And, you know, moderate Democrats who in the past would have been very happy to work with, say a Rex Tillerson and vote for a Secretary of State like that, instead are saying no and are demanding more information. They started boycotting hearings. You even had Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Cory Booker grab a bullhorn and go to the Supreme Court and kind of hold an impromptu rally. So, you know, they're trying. You know, they look a little bit awkward at times when they're doing it because they're not used to it. These are muscles that haven't been flexed in a long time. But clearly, they recognize that there is a lot of there's a lot of energy in opposition, and that's where they're headed at the moment.
Well, let's go back to Betsy DeVos's confirmation hearing from last month. In this clip, when she was questioned by Senator Al Franken.
I would like your views on the relative advantage of measuring, doing assessments and using them to measure proficiency or to measure growth.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I think if I'm understanding your question correctly around proficiency, I would also correlate it to competency and mastery, so that each student is measured according to the advancement that they're making in each subject area.
Well, that's growth. That's not proficiency. So in other words, the growth they're making is in growth. The proficiency is an arbitrary standard.
If they've reached a level, the proficiency is if they've reached a like third grade level for reading, et cetera.
No, I'm talking about the debate between proficiency and growth.
Yes.
And what your thoughts are on them.
Well, I was just asking to clarify then.
Well, this is a subject that has been debated in the education community for years.
That's Al Franken questioning Education Secretary designate Betsy DeVos last month during her confirmation hearing. Ryan Grim, can you comment on what her response was to the questions that Franken was asking her?
It was kind of a flabbergasting response, because this debate between growth and proficiency, I think there are people of good faith on each side of the debate within education policy. But in the era of school assessments, it is kind of one of the fundamental debates in education policy. This is it, like where you stand on whether you should be measuring the growth of a student or whether you should be measuring kind of a flat proficiency at a grade level. Where you stand on that kind of defines your view on education policy today. And what her answer suggested quite clearly is that she hasn't thought about this debate. She's unfamiliar with this debate. And so while a lot of people talk about a level of malevolence within the Trump administration, you also have an extraordinary amount of incompetence and ignorance. To have an education secretary who literally doesn't know about the primary issue, not that she's wrong on the issue necessarily, but she doesn't even know what it is an extraordinary thing. And it flows into putting Ben Carson at the top of housing and urban development, who has absolutely no experience in housing policy whatsoever, and has himself said that he's unqualified for a cabinet position. So, we're in extraordinary territory. And so when Democrats are taking a stand in opposition to a lot of these candidates because the base is pushing them there, when they finally get there, they see that, well, this actually is intellectually the right position, too.
And then, Ryan, you have on Wednesday 2 Republican senators, both women, announcing they will not confirm DeVos as Secretary of Education. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, followed by Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska.
Right, and Susan Collins
Let's go to a clip of them.
In keeping with my past practice, I will vote today to proceed to debate on Mrs. DeVos's nomination. But, Madam President, I cannot vote to confirm her as our nation's next Secretary of Education.
I do not intend to vote on final passage to support Mrs. DeVos to be Secretary of Education. So I thank the chairman of the committee.
Senators Murkowski and Collins. This is quite stunning. It's also interesting that they are women. Women are certainly in the minority in the Senate. You also have the women judges. And the Attorney General, who's gotten in Trump's way when it comes to the immigration ban, blocking these bans, saying that they won't enforce them. But the significance of this, and then what this means, if Senator Sessions were approved as Attorney General before this vote, he would not be able to vote if he were confirmed, and this would mean that DeVos would go down. But his confirmation has just been voted out of the committee, and I'm sure they'll wait so that he can vote. That would then just make this 50-50 unless another Republican says no. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it means they have to keep Jeff Sessions in the Senate as long as they possibly can so that he can be around to vote for DeVos and any other nominees that they feel like are going to be right up against the edge. Because as soon as he becomes Attorney General, he can no longer vote in the Senate. And I think there are a couple other significant things about their vote. One is that while Alaska and Maine are rural states, public education is still an important factor there. And, not only teachers, but parents of children in public schools are extremely motivated. And Collins hinted at this, but Murkowski said it explicitly. She told me she got 30,000 calls over this last week, almost all of them anti-DeVos. And she said that helped her decide to oppose her. So, activism from within these states did, in fact, move these people. Now, a Mitch McConnell spokesman told me that they still have the votes and they're confident that she's going to be confirmed, and Mitch McConnell is known for being quite an extraordinary vote counter. So I would count on her at this point being confirmed, but the level of hostility
towards her. So Pence, though, would have to come, Vice President Pence would have to come the first time ever for a confirmation of a cabinet pick.
Right, exactly. That would be, like you said, that's a historical moment to have an education secretary that is so controversial that even though you have a Senate majority, you need your own vice president to push her over the top.
And now you have Rex Tillerson, the new Secretary of State, immediately jumping into the fray. It has to deal with the travel ban and Iran. Now, Iran he's very familiar with in dealing with Iran around the cruise missile that they just tested. Because he was a longtime CEO of ExxonMobil and actually had some secret negotiations with Iran.
Right. Right, and this is going to be extraordinarily difficult politics for somebody like Rex Tillerson because, you know, he is quite friendly with Vladimir Putin and with Russia, as is Donald Trump. Russia is Iran is the client of Russia. So it's not even clear that Trump knows that he is, on the one hand, picking a fight with the client and on the other hand, cozying up to the boss state. At the same time that he's picking a fight with Australia's prime minister, hanging up the phone on him, and threatening to send troops into Mexico. This is literally just in the last 24 hours.
So on Wednesday, President Trump urged the Republican leadership to consider using the so-called nuclear option, that is, instituting a rule change to prohibit filibusters, to push through the confirmation of Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch.
But if we end up with that gridlock, I would say, if you can, Mitch, go nuclear, because that would be an absolute shame if a man of this quality was caught up in the web. So I would say it's up to Mitch, but I would say go for it.
So, Ryan Grimm, that's Trump saying to go for the nuclear option.
Right. My read on this is that Republicans will end up getting enough Democrats to support this nominee so that they'll get 60 votes and won't actually go nuclear. I think that there's 100%, close to 100% certainty that if they don't get to the 60 votes, they would go nuclear on this. But I think the further significance of this is that if Donald Trump is pushing some legislative agenda in the future, that not a Supreme Court nominee, but just a legislative agenda, and Democrats are filibustering it, you're going to see him pushing for the nuclear option on legislation too. You know, Donald Trump is not somebody who's going to say, oh, well, my agenda can't get through because of the established norms of our democratic society. Well, then oh well, that's too bad, I lost. He's somebody who's going to say, no, we need to change those rules and push that through. So I think you certainly haven't seen the last of that. But you're going to see, I think, Mitch McConnell push back. He doesn't necessarily want the 60-vote threshold to come down because, kind of paradoxically, he loses power relative to Donald Trump then. Because if Mitch McConnell can tell Donald Trump, look, I would love to do your infrastructure project, but I just don't have 60 votes, then there isn't a whole lot Donald Trump can do except push on Twitter and in speeches and in rallies for the nuclear option. So, but that has the capacity then to tear the Republican Party apart heading into 2018. So, you know, who knows where this element of it is going.
It's pretty terrifying watching TV. You see the Iran's missile going off, and then you see nuclear option flashing across the screen back and forth. Of course, the nuclear option is not to do, at least at this point, with Iran.
Yeah, maybe we need a new phrase for what's happening in the Senate, since nuclear option is becoming, you know, literal rather than metaphorical.
And then you have Rex Tillerson facing 1,000 diplomats and others within the State Department signing on against the travel ban. And we're going to end on that with just 30 seconds, Ryan.
Sure. I mean, Rex Tillerson, I don't think, 6 months ago thought there was any possibility that he was going to be Secretary of State of the United States. And now, like you said, he has the entire world against him, but that's kind of a familiar position for an Exxon CEO, and they've managed to thrive despite that.
Well, Ryan Grimm, we thank you so much for being with us. Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Huffington Post. We'll link to your story. After trying everything else, Democrats have decided to listen to their voters. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the travel ban. Stay with us. Sari Al-Sawas here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
New information is emerging about U.S. State Department guidance issued the day President Trump signed an executive order temporarily banning all refugees as well as all citizens from 7 Muslim-majority nations, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria and Yemen, from entering the United States. WBUR has acquired a department memo dated January 27th that provisionally revokes all non-immigrant and immigrant visas of nationals from the 7 countries as of Friday. According to the memo, the revocation does not apply to diplomatic visas.
Well, for more, we go to Seattle, Washington, where we're joined by Matt Adams, legal director for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, lead counsel for a class action lawsuit challenging Donald Trump's executive order. His lawsuit was filed in Seattle on behalf of 3 parents legally living in the U.S. who are now restricted from bringing their children from Somalia, Syria and Yemen. Matt, welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us who your clients are and what's happened in the last week.
Thank you. Our clients are 3 parents. One is 2 of them are United States citizens, and 1 of them is a lawful permanent resident. And so we have, for example, a Syrian mother, a lawful permanent resident, who lives here in Seattle and has been separated from her child, a 16-year-old boy. She's filed a visa petition. It's been approved. He is in desperate circumstances in war-torn Syria. And now, after she submitted her application with the consulate, the president has issued this order putting an indefinite hold and separation between her and her child. We have a mother and a father are both United States citizens. They have 2 other daughters who are here, also U.S. citizens, who are separated from their 12-year-old daughter who is not. Their application had already been processed, had already been approved. The father went to pick up his daughter, who's from Yemen. They had to travel to Jordan. Yemen is so dangerous that our own U.S. consulate is pulled out of that. So they had their interview in Jordan. It was approved. They showed up at the airport. And when they arrived at the airport, they were told the father, of course, can get on the plane because he's a U.S. citizen. But the 12-year-old daughter has to stay behind. And of course, what is the father to do? Right now, him and his daughter are left in a desperate situation. He doesn't know what he can do. He can't send her back to the danger that exists in Yemen. We have one other client, a mother who is, again, a U.S. citizen, and her 6-year-old daughter is left in Somalia. And again, a visa petition has already been approved. The application went forward with the consulate, and now President Trump has said, no, these children are a threat to our national security because they come from predominantly Muslim countries that have been targeted. And a hold has been placed on them and hundreds of others who are like them have reached out to us. And so these individuals are bringing a lawsuit not just on behalf of themselves, but others who are similarly situated.
Well, Matt Adams, can you just tell us what is the status of your lawsuit now? What are you arguing?
We are arguing that this executive order blatantly violates not only the United States Constitution and its guarantee of equal protection for all under the law, and its guarantee of due process for all, but it violates the Immigration and Nationality Act, which explicitly states that visas will be issued without discriminating based on national origin or country of birth. And yet that's precisely what Trump has done with his executive order. It said, I'm going to target these individuals because they come from a country, not because of anything to do with them individually. And in fact, it's absurd on its face if you look at it and say, how in the world can he be trying to tie this to national security when he's barring children from coming in to be reunited with their parents who are already living here, their parents who are United States citizens and lawful permanent residents?
Well, Matt Adams, we want to thank you for being with us. We hope to have you on in the coming days with your clients. Matt Adams is legal director for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, lead counsel for the class action lawsuit challenging Donald Trump's executive order. His lawsuit filed in Seattle on behalf of 3 parents legally living in the U.S. who are now restricted from bringing their kids from Somalia, Syria and Yemen. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Prominent white supremacist and Donald Trump supporter Richard Spencer has been back in the news this week after he praised Trump for not mentioning the 6 million Jews killed in a statement commemorating International Holocaust Memorial Day. Trump has faced widespread criticism for the omission, but the administration has repeatedly defended the statement. Senator Tim Kaine went as far as calling it a form of Holocaust denial. Spencer, however, praised the statement as the de-Judification of the Holocaust.
Earlier this week, Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to Andrea Pitzer. Her upcoming book is titled One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. It looks at mass civilian detention without trial from 1896 to today. Andrea Pitzer began by commenting on Trump's statement.
One thing I think is very interesting about the omission of the Jews in Holocaust Remembrance Day statement is, again, looking back at the history, that it's perhaps a mistake that was done at first. It may have been an omission. It's a very strange omission, given all the concerns that were raised about whether Trump had the support of white nationalists and whether that was reciprocated during the campaign, to have forgotten that when it would have been an easy thing to do correctly. But even if one gives them the benefit of a doubt that it was an error, when it was pointed out, it was doubled down on. And there was the strange statement that it was actually meant to be inclusive. It was including all groups. And I think that's more where it becomes disturbing, because this is one of the lines that we've seen in Soviet Russia and in some white nationalist sectors, that, well, sure, they say a lot of people died in the war, as if it were just an inevitable casualty of war. And certainly tens of millions of people were casualties of combat and other crises during the war, as there are in many wars. But it's really a singular moment. The attempt to eradicate a people from the face of the earth, and it was also the Jews, but especially the Jews, but also the Roma and Sinti, the Gypsies, as they also were known. And this was really to bend the power of a state during wartime, to eradicate people from the face of the earth, even when it went against your war interests, is a really singular thing. And I think to talk about the Holocaust without acknowledging that is really to miss its singular moment in history.
So, Andrea Pitzer, I wanted to go to what the White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said, defending the decision not to reference Jews in Trump's statement on International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Well, I think he's aware of what people have been saying, but I think by and large he's been praised for it. I think the president recognized the tremendous loss of life that came from the Holocaust. But I think with respect to, Israel and the Jewish people specifically, there's been no better friend than Donald Trump when it comes to protecting Israel, building a better friendship with Israel. You look at what Prime Minister Netanyahu's talked about. He welcomes this administration. He appreciates the friendship and respect that he has shown to Israel and to the Jewish people. But to suggest otherwise, John, I frankly got to be honest. I mean, the president went out of his way to recognize the Holocaust and the suffering that went through it and the people that were affected by it and the loss of life, and to make sure that America never forgets what so many people went through, whether they were Jews or Gypsies, gays, disability, priests.
So that was Sean Spicer, who is the White House press secretary, defending not referring specifically to Jews on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Andrea Pitzer.
Well, one thing that's interesting about that is that he said he went out of his way. Well, I don't think he really went out of his way. Presidents have been issuing these proclamations before, so it's not some new effort that was made. And the second thing is, I think that the language that was used, and it was something very close to ensure that the forces of evil never again defeat the powers of good. And that goes back to what I was saying before, this idea of stripping out context and history. That sounds like something from Harry Potter. That sounds like some apocalyptic fairy tale. The Holocaust and World War II were very specific events. And I think to sort of neuter them down to these narratives of just simple good and evil that can be carried around and used for other purposes, it goes to the same kind of trend that the treatment of immigrants does, which, it really doesn't look at the exact context that we're in and help us make good judgments about it. It renders it down to something that can be used for propaganda.
At the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there is one of the signs that's up there is a placard that says early warning signs of fascism. And it has a list that includes powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for human rights, identification of enemies as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, corporate power protected, labor power suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment. Your thoughts as this list of the early signs of fascism at the Holocaust Museum?
Well, I think the list speaks for itself. At this point, given the blitz that's been run on the normal democratic process by the administration that's just been in for a week and a half at this point, I do think that we have to say that even now that he's in power, the authoritarian tendencies that Trump showed before the election are definitely coming into play. I think it's important to remember, however, that the U.S. is not Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Journalists can report, lawyers can litigate, individuals can run for local office and call their representatives and protest. So whether Trump is actually an authoritarian, he's not in an authoritarian state at this point. So I think there needs to be a lot of concern. But I do think that there doesn't need to be panic at this point. It needs to be a kind of strategic awareness and consideration of what our options are as journalists, lawyers, as individuals, and as citizens.
Can you talk about what President Trump has said he's going to do? Keep a list of, quote, immigrant crimes.
Well, this weekly report that he has called for recalls a number of things from the past that we have seen before, which is this move to isolate and identify and then vilify a vulnerable minority community in order to move against it. I just went back last night and reread his speech from when he declared his candidacy, and the Mexican rapist comment was in from the beginning. And so this has been a theme throughout. And we see back in Nazi Germany, there was a Nazi paper called Der Stürmer, and they had a department called Letterbox. And readers were invited to send in stories of supposed Jewish crimes. And Der Stürmer would publish them, and they would include some pretty horrific graphic illustrations of these crimes as well. And there was even a sort of a light version of it, if you will, racism light, in which the Neues Volk, which was more like a Look or a Life magazine, which normally highlighted beautiful Aryan families and their beautiful homes, would run a feature like The Criminal Jew, and they would show photos of Jewish-looking, as they called it, people who represented different kinds of crimes that one ought to watch out for from Jews. So this preoccupation with focusing in on one subset of the population's crimes and then depicting that as somehow depraved and abnormal from the main population is something we've seen quite a bit in the past. Even in the U.S., before Japanese-American internment, you had newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle running about the unassimilability of the Japanese immigrants and also the crime tendencies and depravities they had, which were distinguished from the main American population.
And, of course, this flies in the face of all studies that have shown that the crime rate among immigrant populations in the United States is actually lower than it is among ordinary American citizens. But yet this is attempting to take isolated incidents or particular crimes and sort of raise them to the level of a general trend, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's part of a disturbing narrative in which you strip out the broader context and the specificity of actions like this, and you try to weave them into this preset narrative of good and evil somehow that really ends up being simple and dishonest and very counterproductive for the society as a whole. But yes, in general, these groups would want to keep a lower profile. They would want to stay off law enforcement's radar. And so this is one of the reasons that's been suspected that that's actually a lower crime rate. But if you get a few dramatic images, and don't forget now, this won't be coming out. You know, Breitbart has had this black crimes tag that they've used to try to do a similar thing in the past, and now we have Bannon in the White House. And it's sort of a scaling up and doing this with a different minority group. And you'll have these, what will no doubt be very dramatic narratives that will come forward that will eclipse the larger picture, and they're going to have the imprimatur of a government report, which I think is another disturbing aspect.
I wanted to ask you, Andrea Pitzer, about the White House considering a plan to make visitors reveal cell phone, Internet data. Describe the role mass surveillance plays in authoritarian societies.
Well, over time, we've seen that it's very hard to have an authoritarian or a totalitarian society, a state that runs without a secret police. And you can't, what you need the secret police for is to gather information secretly. The surveillance techniques and abilities that we have today are really unparalleled in history. And while we can't yet be sure what the Trump administration's motives are, what they have at their disposal is far greater than what was had in Soviet Russia, in Nazi Germany. I'm thinking in particular of Himmler complaining that he had trouble keeping track of all the people he needed to because he needed so many agents. But when you have the kind of technology that we do, you don't need as many people if you have the right tools to use. And so the ability to gather that kind of information and then potentially use it domestically or on foreigners who happen to be here, I think is something that's worth paying attention to be concerned about.
That's Andrea Pitzer, journalist and author who writes about lost and forgotten history. Her upcoming book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. Stay with us. Gamliel Shalom and Walid Baraj. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
As attorneys and activists continue to fight Donald Trump's travel ban on refugees and nationals from 7 Muslim-majority countries, a new article takes a sweeping look at history to find what it portends. Perhaps more fascinating is that the story involves the family of one of the senior-most members of the Trump administration. In Nobody Wanted to Take Us In, the story of Jared Kushner's family and mine, Nation magazine's senior editor Lizzie Ratner looks at the journey of both her family and that of Donald Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, the husband of Ivanka Trump. Both Ratner's and Kushner's grandparents came to the United States as Jewish immigrants from Poland as the German occupation was ramping up and U.S. borders were closing down.
Jared Kushner's grandmother, Ray Kushner, was born February 27, 1923, in Nowogrodzk, Poland, and lost most of her family during the Holocaust. In 1982, Ray Kushner was interviewed as part of a project for the Kean University of New Jersey Holocaust Resource Center and recalled attempts by her family to flee before the German occupation.
But we felt the anti-Semitism. We felt that it's coming something. But we couldn't help ourselves. The door was closed that time. You know how hard it was to get a visa to Israel to go? Young girls and boys used to sit in a kibbutz for 3-4 years till one used to go to Palestine. To America, very hard. If you send papers, you need to wait for 2-3 years till you get a visa at that time.
So your family, your father actually was making attempts in 1935, 36?
He had a sister here in the United States, my father. And we tried, we heard the times as good, we felt, but we couldn't do nothing. Later in 1941, beginning of 1941, Germany took over us.
That's Ray Kushner, the grandmother of Jared Kushner. She was speaking in 1982. She died in 2004. Joining us now, the nation's Lizzie Ratner. Her piece, Nobody Wanted to Take Us In, the story of Jared Kushner's family and mine. Talk about why you wrote this, Lizzie.
I wrote this story because, for a bunch of reasons. With the election, I began thinking about immigration, and I knew Trump had warned, immigrants were going to be targets, refugees were going to be targets. My family was enormously lucky. We got to the United States at the end of a period of really rich immigration from Eastern Europe. But it was at the very tail end. My grandfather arrived in 1920. He arrived from Białystok, Poland, which was not a happy place to be at the time. It was the end of World War I. There were pogroms. There was hunger. And
what do you mean by pogroms?
Pogroms were sort of attacks on Jewish people that took place throughout Eastern Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th century, possibly before that. And so he came here in 1920, and it turned out to be an enormously fortuitous moment. He had incredible timing because it was a moment of sort of rising xenophobia in the United States. The United States was not happy about all the refugees coming from Eastern Europe, coming from Southern Europe, and so the country passed a series of extreme anti-immigrant measures. And I've always thought, my God, my family got so lucky coming here 6 months before one of the most severe anti-immigrant measures of that period was passed. If they hadn't got here in 1920, they might not have gotten to the United States. And what happened to Jews who didn't get to the United States is that many, but not all, but many ended up dying in the Holocaust. So I was sort of thinking about all of this as the election happened, and I began to wonder, well, Jared Kushner is a very powerful person in the now Trump administration. I knew that his family, they were Holocaust survivors, and I said, I bet there's an immigration story because many Jews who came to the United States in the 1920s, and then many sort of people who survived the Holocaust and didn't survive, had stories of attempts to getting to this country and sort of failed attempts to getting here because there were these immigration laws that really cut the borders off in 1920-21. So I just did some very basic research. I did some Googling, and I found this remarkable interview with Ray Kushner, who happens to be Jared Kushner's grandmother. And in the interview, and we just saw a clip of it, but in the interview, we hear her talking about her family's attempts to come to the United States in the 1930s. As I said, really 1921, 24, these two anti-immigrant measures were passed. And after that, immigration from Eastern Europe didn't completely stop, but it became a trickle. And so you have these numerous stories of Jewish families in Eastern Europe in the 1930s who are saying, oh my God, there's anti-Semitism rising around us, and we need to get out of here. And yet when they tried, they found that the borders were closed. So Ray Kushner was one of them, and we hear in this clip how her family felt anti-Semitism couldn't get here.
Well, let's go back to Ray Kushner in her own words. Speaking in 1982, she explained the difficulty her family faced trying to gain entry to other countries.
And we were in Italy for 3.5 years. We wanted to go all over, to Africa, to Australia, to Israel. Nobody opened the door for us. Nobody wanted to take us in. 3.5 years we were waiting to get a visa. We had family in the United States. My husband had a sister, he had cousins, very fine people.
Ray Kushner went on to question the role of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt.
We never can understand this. Even our good President Roosevelt, how come he kept the door so closed for us for such a long time? How come our boat went for exodus on the border and returned back to be killed? This question I'll never know. And nobody will give me the answer. And with this mind, we live a very hard life.
That's Ray Kushner, the grandmother of Jared Kushner. So, Lizzie, in your research, did you find anywhere Jared Kushner's mention of his own family's story of coming to the U.S.?
Yeah. In August of this past year, there was a big furor, pardon the expression, because Donald Trump tweeted out an image sort of calling Hillary Clinton crooked and there was sort of an image of a Jewish star and a pile of cash. And it was a moment when many people said, you know, the Trump campaign has been supported by anti-Semites. It has been engaging with anti-Semites. Is Donald Trump anti-Semitic? And it was after that that Jared Kushner wrote an article in the newspaper that he owns called the New York Observer, saying, Donald Trump is not anti-Semitic. I know what anti-Semitism is because my grandparents suffered the worst of anti-Semitism. They were survivors of the Holocaust. And so that was sort of a moment that he resurrected their story, but in order to justify the man who, you know, arguably was deploying anti-Semitic motifs, and who is now, of course, in the White House, furthering a regime of an anti-immigrant regime, which really does echo the anti-immigrant regime that was put in place in the 1920s that ultimately kept out Jews like the Kushners.
And so what about the travel ban today with that Donald Trump just imposed a week ago that led to a revolt all over the country?
Yeah, well, I think history is really critical here. The present, you know, the present is echoing the past. And we just heard a segment about the 1930s in Germany. But we have our own history here that foreshadows this moment. And our own history is a history filled with strains of xenophobia and hate, which had real consequences for people. So I just want to talk for 1 second about sort of rhetorical parallels between the past and the present. When I was researching the 1920s and these 1920 anti-immigrant acts that had such gruesome consequences for people, I was struck by the parallels in language. So you had Jewish people referred to as physically deficient, abnormally twisted, un-American, filthy, a peril to this country, sort of a danger in all sorts of ways. Jews were conceived as both a threat to the economy, but also a threat to national security. The idea was that Jews who came from Eastern Europe, which was sort of a hotbed of Bolshevism and radicalism, would come here, turn our country red from the inside out, and destroy it. We hear the same, or really parallel rhetoric today being thrown against Muslims, people from Muslim countries who are being sort of described as a threat to our society, a fifth column, Trojan horse. I mean, Donald Trump used the term Trojan horse. You could have heard that applied against Jews in the 1920s and the 1940s. And I think we can say, you know, horrible things happened to people. Horrible things were visited on immigrants and desperate refugees who wanted to come here.
Let's go back to Ray Kushner in this interview she did in the Kane University of New Jersey's Holocaust Research Center.
Let's hope it's not going to happen again. But it can happen. If you don't watch, who comes up? When I came to Washington, the Nazis are going with the swastikas in front of the White House. And they're going on free. And this scares us. This is very painful.
That was Ray Kushner, Jared Kushner's grandmother. Jared Kushner, one of the top aides to Donald Trump in the White House, and his son-in-law. Today, you quote the head of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Hayes, who says, the way we describe ourselves is that we used to resettle refugees because they were Jewish. Now we settle refugees because we are Jewish.
Yeah, it was a deeply moving comment that Mark Hetfield of Hayes said to me, and I think it captures a sentiment in part of the Jewish community, and that should really be the sentiment of everybody in this country who was an immigrant and is now assimilated and is here, which is that, you know, there was a time when our ancestors were in desperate need, and some people responded to that need, and many people around the world didn't. And now we have an obligation as people who are here now, who've benefited from all the privileges of this country, to keep the doors open for other desperate people. There's another amazing quote I just want to end with. Mark Hetfield also said, you know, for us to come here, for us, and he's referring to Jewish people at this moment, but for Jews to say, we're here now, it's okay to close the doors on other people, is morally reprehensible. And I don't think I could have ever said it better.
In the conversation we played with an interview between Jeff Sessions, who was being interviewed by Stephen Bannon, top aide to President Trump, referring to the old immigration laws.
Yeah, I was just listening to that. So Jeff Sessions, you know, in this interview you played yesterday, is celebrating the 1924 Act, the Reed-Johnson Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act, which closed the border for Jews. And I need to also emphasize for millions of people from other parts of the world, too. It wasn't just Jews, but we know the sort of consequences were catastrophic for Jews. But it's terrifying to me that Jeff Sessions is celebrating this act that we now know and regard, you know, is universally regarded as xenophobic and destructive and baseless, and a terrible mark on this country's history.
We're going to have to leave it there. Lizzie Ratner, senior editor at The Nation, will link to her article, Nobody Wanted to Take Us In, the story of Jared Kushner's family and mine. And that does it for today's show. A correction, our headlines on Wednesday included a claim by a man who told WJBK in Detroit that his mother, an Iraqi-American green card holder, died after being denied entry into the United States. An imam in Detroit has since told the station that the woman died in Iraq 5 days before the ban went into place. That does it for the show. Thanks for joining us.